Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 20. Today we'll discuss why we argue. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your weekly homework document, as well as access to a publicly accessible argument. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define the term argument, we'll investigate the purpose of arguments, and we'll examine the consequences and implications of argument. Okay, so what is an argument? It's first important to note that there are a few shifts that we want to be aware of in how arguments are developed and the reason that we make arguments. At its core, though, an argument is essentially your attempt to use language in a persuasive way as to get a specific audience to engage in an action or accept a specific thought. So when we think of an argument, it can be everything from as simple as I make the argument that apples are the best thing to eat as soon as you wake up in the morning. So that is an argument that I want to make. And so I am trying to get my audience to accept the idea that apples are the best thing to eat first thing in the morning. So when we think about, when we go beyond that to think about the different ways we can understand an argument, we first have the classical understandings, and largely that has been the framework that we've been operating within throughout this semester. You'll notice a familiar name right out the gate, Aristotle. Now, Aristotle is the dude who we looked at during Unit 1, who basically suggested that we can analyze certain rhetorical practices through the use of logos, pathos, and ethos, and how effectively a writer or speaker uses logos, pathos, and ethos to persuade their audience, to get their audience to act in a certain way or to think in a certain way. He goes beyond that a bit more, though, and identifies three specific types of arguments. And he notes that they are sort of temporally bound, if you will, or they're sort of time sensitive. The first that we want to consider would be deliberative rhetoric, or a deliberative type argument. And that focuses on the future. What should we do? What actions should we take? In fact, you can see Project 4 as being a deliberative argument, if you will, because you're saying this is a problem that exists, and if we want to solve this problem, this is going to be the best line of action. He then focuses on the present tense, which we see through judicial rhetoric or judicial argument. Now, like its name suggests, we can think about judicial rhetoric as sort of court-based rhetoric. And it often falls down to is something in the moment, good or bad? Is the person guilty or not guilty based on the evidence that is available? Now, judicial doesn't really think about the future. It looks briefly, at the past as a form of evidence, but is really focused on what action are we going to take right here and right now. The final one would be epideictic, which is really focused on assigning praise or blame. Now, in terms of how Aristotle writes about it in his work on rhetoric, it's very epideictic rhetoric. There are a lot of parallels with delivering a eulogy. So basically saying this person in their life did this or did that, and it was good or it was bad. And of course, we can expand that to other considerations as well, and not just to humans, but we can say, oh, this entity, this corporation, this tool, this technology did X, Y, and Z, and that was good or that was bad. And it focuses more, though, on what has already happened and the observations that through hindsight we can make. In line with Aristotle, years, and a couple of empires down the road, the Roman Quintilian basically took what Aristotle was saying and further grounded it to say that argument through rhetoric should be situated in the public good. And Quintilian's idea was, okay, well, if you are going to induce an audience to think a certain way or perform a certain action, it should at least be done with good intentions to benefit the community that it directly applies to, or who would be seeing the consequences, good or bad, of that argument. Now, both of their works, as well as the works that came after it and really stemmed from both Aristotle and Quintilian, there's an emphasis on persuasion and argumentation through rational back and forth among diverse perspectives. Now, their work is also predicated on the fact that not everyone agrees with each other. Now, with their work, though, and with more classical understandings, they really focus on this win or lose type mentality to argumentation. You propose an argument at the end of the day to win over the public, to have your idea implemented. And so, again, there's this really sort of win-lose dichotomy at play here. But of course, it is predicated on the fact that not everyone's going to agree with one another, and so that necessitates the arguments to be made. More contemporary takes, though, and when I say contemporary takes, a majority of these ideas stemmed from 1940s, 1950s, and onwards. Some of the more contemporary takes on argument and argumentation really start with Kenneth Burke, and he understands argument as a means of identification. So how do you take something that you want to do or something that you want people to think, and how do you use that as a way to connect with other individuals or other communities? Now, because of this, Burke, as well as others who are more in the contemporary vein, basically said, let's focus on connecting individuals through ideas. And so rather than sort of this point system that we might see in more classical understandings, like, oh, I did a really good job, playing to my audience's emotions or their understandings of logic, rather than kind of being that quantified understanding, Burke looks at it in a more qualitative way to say, okay, well, how can we use human connection to not only encourage others to think a certain way or to act a certain way, but to also determine if that is the right course of action. When we think of contemporary takes then on what an argument is, we can also see it as an entrance into understanding difference. Now, rather than focusing on does an argument win or lose, like we see with the classical understandings, contemporary take really says, okay, not so much focusing on the winning or losing here, but how much did we come to understand about our audience, about those posing different perspectives? What have we come to learn and understand about what they want, what their values are, and how that fits among what we're suggesting, and how we can go about further suggesting that. So there are a couple of different ways that we can approach it, and so these are just things to be mindful of as we move throughout Project 4. How are arguments made? Now that we've defined an argument as a way to persuade people to action, we oftentimes might think of an argument as, a one and done statement. I think apples are the best thing to eat as soon as you wake up in the morning, right? But an argument is so much more than that. And we're going to look at this in greater detail in the next core lecture, but it's good to just kind of get your feet wet with these terms now. Now, all good arguments, they're not just simple statements, rather they are well-developed thoughts that typically extend pages, and they must include a thesis or a claim, reasons, evidence, warrants, and counter-arguments. So again, we'll focus on more of these later, but just start thinking perhaps of how you've heard these terms used in the past and how you might see them at play both in classical and contemporary takes of rhetoric. All right, where do we see arguments? Where can we possibly encounter them in our day-to-day lives? Well, I'll start by, identifying three major places that we see them. We see them in political addresses or content regarding political or social decisions. We see them in commercials, and we see them in courtrooms. So when we think of political addresses, we hear, especially with the next election gearing up, vote for me for this reason, or I'm the best candidate for this reason. I deserve your vote because I'm pushing X, Y, and Z, which is good for you for these reasons. We hear them in terms of supporting certain legislation, and also when elected officials are debating certain ideas and potential laws in front of each other on various official congressional floors. Think about commercials. As a consumer, commercials come on to persuade you to buy a product or to invest in a service. So we can see here through the Pizza Hut example, you might have to share a bus seat, but you won't have to share your pizza. So, that is persuading you to say, buy our pizza and you can have it all to yourself. It's all yours. You don't have to share with anyone. And that's why you should buy a Pizza Hut pizza. And so they are trying to, at least in this case, Pizza Hut is trying to get you to buy their pizza over, let's say, going to Domino's, or let's say, cooking at home, or going to Taco Bell or another place. We also see arguments play out in the courtroom. So as individuals are making their arguments for why they are or are not guilty, they'll cite specific reasons, they'll introduce evidence, form conclusions based off of that evidence, and they're making arguments to say to the jury, please find this client guilty or find this client not guilty. And so all of their arguments circulate around that. But of course, these aren't the only ways we see arguments manifesting in day-to-day life, whether academic or in non-academic settings. You think about it, you probably make arguments all the time, arguments to go see a specific movie with your friends or family, arguments about where would be the best place to spend Christmas vacation. So you can think about various arguments as they occur in your everyday life, and we certainly do see that. And again, these are not the only places you'll see arguments, but they are some of the most common and accessible, especially as we see publicly accessible arguments. Okay, so what can arguments do? This is something so important to keep in mind. It's not just that we can make an argument, which is great, but we also want to think about what the consequences of that argument will be. One of my favorite sayings is, yes, you have the right to free speech, but you are not free of the consequences. And I think, when we can think of arguments in the same way to say, yeah, we can make these arguments, but we have to be aware of what potential implications that argument holds for the people affected, the communities affected by the arguments I'm making. So, in a more academic sense, we can think of arguments as a way to continue conversation. So recall when we looked at it in both the classical and contemporary sense, both are predicated on the existence of difference. Both accept the fact that there are disagreements among individuals. And so remember with the synthesis assignment that we did, Project 2, you basically at times had to situate yourself in the ongoing conversation to say, okay, well, based off of what I've read, here are my thoughts and here are my opinions based off of the different solutions that I've discussed. Arguments can give you a way to do that in a more well-developed and more well-rounded manner. So you could even see Project 4 as a detailed extension to what you noted in Project 2. So maybe in Project 2, you took a paragraph to say, okay, well, in response to what I'm seeing, here's where I find myself sort of fitting into this. And here would be, some thoughts I had on the issue. Well, Project 4, you say, okay, well, here's a thought, that I identified identified in Project 2, now I'm going to expand on that and, try to demonstrate why it is an idea worth considering or an idea worth implementing and how it fits among the ongoing conversations regarding the topic that it centers around. Arguments can also begin new conversations. So a way to say, well, we haven't thought about this yet. We haven't thought about, approaching this problem in this way. So let's start a new conversation on how we can, think about this problem through this lens. And then arguments, I think, most importantly, because I think this is where we can start to understand the consequences of arguments. Arguments can enact social change. So you even think about the topic that you have selected and written on for projects 2, 3, and 4. Ultimately, you are making an argument that calls for some degree of social change, whether that be access to certain resources, concepts, or substances. Others are enacting for social change regarding education, regarding gun ownership, regarding access to certain technologies. So, when we think about the arguments that we're making, we want to think not just, okay, well, how can I support my argument, but if my argument is successful, what will likely come of it? What will be the most likely consequences or implications? And so this is something that, especially as we're in the writing process, we want to continuously circle back to and think, again, if this argument is successful, what is likely to come of it? So here's what I would like you to do for the lecture assignment. I'd like you to identify an argument you've encountered this week. It doesn't matter how the argument is communicated, it just needs to be an argument of some kind. So it should be a message that tries to induce a specific audience to think a certain way or to act a certain way. It can be a political ad, it can be a commercial. You can give me an example of how your child tried to convince you that cookies would be a perfect meal for dinner, so that also could be, an example that you use. So it just has to be an argument that has presented itself to you or that you have encountered this week. I'd like you to compose a brief write-up on that argument, and in that write-up, you'll need to discuss the following. What argument is being made? So what is the speaker trying to get you to think or do? What is the function of the argument? Does it focus on what should be done? Is it focusing on what we should do in the here and now? Is it focusing on who we need to praise or blame for certain actions or things that we're seeing? And think about who would be impacted if the argument were successful. So if the candidate of the political campaign video that you watch, that candidate were successful, who would be impacted by that person's taking office? If your kid convinced you that cookies were an appropriate dinner time meal, who would be impacted by that? So these are things that you'll want to consider and theorize in your response. All right, so you'll need to include your Core Lecture 20 summary and assignment in your Week 11 homework submission. Overall, your Week 11 homework submission should include your summaries and assignments for Core Lectures 20 and 21, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. This is all going to be due to Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, November 3rd. If you have any questions or would like to chat about these concepts further, please feel free to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.